life. This is not just a story about the past. It's a reflection of struggles humanity has faced throughout history and in many ways still faces today. From ancient times to modern societies, there have always been moments when faith, freedom, and culture come under fire, when powers greater than individuals try to silence voices that refuse to bow. To understand the courage of those who stood against such oppression, we must travel back to a time when Israel was caught in the iron grip of the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids, heirs to the fractured empire of Alexander the Great, were not content with military power alone. They sought to reshape the hearts and minds of those they ruled, erasing the distinct faith of Israel and replacing it with Greek customs, gods, and philosophies. In this struggle, an ordinary people were forced into extraordinary choices. Do they abandon their covenant with God to survive? Or do they risk everything to hold on to the truth of their identity? The streets of Jerusalem in those days were tense with fear. Greek soldiers marched openly, their presence a daily reminder that the land of David and Solomon was no longer free. Sacred practices, circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary laws were banned under threat of death. Scrolls of the law were confiscated and burned, holy altars were defiled, and the temple itself, the very dwelling place of God, was transformed into a shrine to Zeus. What had been the pride of a people became a symbol of humiliation. Imagine being told that the faith passed down from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was now worthless, that the covenant between God and his people was to be broken at sword point. This was more than political oppression. It was an assault on the soul of a nation. Yet history has shown us something remarkable. When faith is outlawed, when truth is buried, it has a way of rising again, carried by those unwilling to surrender. Out of the shadows of fear emerged a group of ordinary men and women whose defiance turned them into legends. They were not kings or prophets at the start, but farmers, priests, sons and daughters, people who chose to resist when surrender seemed easier. In their struggle, we see the timeless story of how the smallest spark of faith can ignite a flame powerful enough to outlast empires. This story, known to history as the Maccabean Revolt, is not simply about war or rebellion. It is about identity, courage, and the refusal to let faith be extinguished. It is about a people who understood that freedom without faith is no freedom at all, and that true victory is not measured by armies, but by the endurance of the Spirit. And though their enemies sought to erase them, the story of their defiance has been preserved for generations as a reminder that even in the darkest times, ordinary rebels can become extraordinary heroes. But this is not just their story, it is also our story. Every generation faces its own kind of oppression, sometimes obvious, sometimes subtle. There are moments when culture, politics, or ideology seeks to pressure individuals to conform, to silence conviction, to trade truth for comfort. Think of how often people today feel the weight of hiding who they truly are, whether it's their faith, their culture, or their heritage, just to fit into a world that demands uniformity. The ancient struggle of Israel under the Seleucids echoes into our present moment, reminding us that the cost of freedom has always been high, but so has the reward for those who stand firm. Imagine sitting with one of those rebels in the hills outside Jerusalem, a young man who only months before had been tilling his father's fields. He grips a worn blade, not forged in a king's armory, but sharpened in secret under the cover of night. His eyes burn with determination, not because he loves war, but because he cannot bear to see his people's covenant destroyed. He tells you, "I fight not because I want to, but because my God and my people leave me no choice." You can feel his heartbeat in those words, a heartbeat that belongs not only to him, but to all who refuse to bow to tyranny. The theme we will explore in this journey is simple yet powerful: how ordinary rebels became legendary, Their resistance began in whispers and ended in shouts, and along the way their courage left an imprint that outlasted their enemies. They remind us that greatness does not begin in palaces, but in the willingness of the common man and woman to say no when the world demands yes. And as we step deeper into their story, we will see how the God of Israel used the humble to confound the mighty, the faithful few, to shake the powers of the earth. So as you listen, don't just hear this as history, hear it as a challenge. What are the sacred things in your own life worth defending? What truths are you willing to risk for, even when the world says it's safer to remain silent? The rebels of old are not just distant figures. They are mirrors, reflecting the choices we all must face in our own way. And if this story moves you, if it stirs something inside you, then join us on this journey. Subscribe to the Bible Says channel and help us reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers, so more people can hear these forgotten stories of faith and freedom. Share this with those who need a reminder that courage still matters. If you'd like to support this work further, you can send a super thanks and help us continue bringing you hidden truths from the pages of history. And we'd love to hear from you. Comment your name, your city, and the time you're watching. Finally, check the description below for links to the complete Bible with 88 books and the full Book of Enoch in English, so you can explore these powerful texts for yourself. Because when faith is outlawed, when truth is suppressed, the story of the faithful rebels becomes more important than ever, and it begins here. Prior to the uprising, Israel was a deeply conflicted world, both internally and externally. A new cultural order emerged following Alexander the Great's swift conquests that swept across the known world. In addition to banners and weapons, his armies carried Greek traditions, art, and ideals. This Hellenistic influence started to change people's very manner of speaking, dressing, and even thinking. After Alexander's death, his enormous empire fell apart, and Judea was ruled by the Seleucid kings. They were committed to using Greek language, Greek gods, and Greek lifestyles to unite their subjects. They believed that changing the mindset of people they subjugated was more important than simply using force to rule. This was no typical cultural influence for the Jewish people, who had always considered themselves chosen to uphold the law and live under the covenant with their father's God. It was an attack on who they were. Idols were erected in towns where previously only the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was revered, and Greek festivals clashed with Hebrew customs. Greek gymnasiums and marketplaces brimmed with offerings to the pagan gods, and young men were urged to break with their forefathers. Every household was burdened with the demands to stop observing the Sabbath, dietary regulations, and circumcision. Families were split up. Some parents encouraged their children to adopt Greek customs, speak the language fluently, wear Greek, short tunics, and go to gymnasiums where the young people exercised in ways that were embarrassing to Jewish modesty out of fear of punishment or a desire for social advancement. Others fought tenaciously, claiming that adherence to the covenant was more valuable than life itself, more valuable than wealth, and more valuable than safety. Conversations became heated at family tables, with mothers torn between their devotion to God's commandments and their love for their children, and sons challenging fathers. The rulers of Seleucia were not tolerant. In the center of Jerusalem, they became more and more ruthless, requiring sacrifices to Zeus and other Greek deities. This was unimaginable to the faithful, a desecration of all that was sacred. The images of alien gods had corrupted the temple, which had once been the site of worship and the meeting point of heaven and earth. Priests who ought to have guided the populace in holiness were under pressure to make concessions, and some of them did so after being seduced by influence and bribes. For many pious Jews, every season seemed to bring their country closer to oblivion. Just as debilitating as the religious pressures were the social ones. While young men who adhered to the law were ridiculed, shunned, and viewed as backward, those who embraced Greek culture were praised and frequently granted privileges. Rich families occasionally opted for assimilation because they discovered that assuming Greek names and traditions allowed them to gain influence. However, the impoverished, who were already having difficulty surviving due to taxes and unstable political conditions, had little to gain from a compromise. They whispered the Psalms and told the tales of their ancestors who had survived Egypt, Babylon, and Persia, carrying their devotion in their hearts, frequently in secret. The question now was whether they would withstand or eventually shatter under the Seleucids. With each decree and every effort to take away their identity, the tension increased. The internal betrayal was what made it worse. In their own communities, Jews who worked with the Seleucids came to uphold Greek law. Those who circumcised their sons, those who gathered to study the Torah in secret, and those who refused to eat pork would all be reported. Neighbors' trust was damaged. Even a relative might betray for survival or favor, so who could one trust? It was a spiritual war, not just a conflict between tradition and innovation. The covenant was more than just tradition. It was the lifeblood of the populace and the connection that bound God to his people. Abandoning it meant letting go of their destiny and the promises that had gotten them through exile and back. Every act of defiance turned into an act of faith, a statement that they would sooner die than break the law. There were tales of old men refusing to taste forbidden foods even when threatened with torture, and of mothers who chose to let their sons be martyred rather than submit to pagan customs. In addition to being tragedies, these tales served as reminders that faith could triumph over fear and as a source of hope. The extent of this devotion was underestimated by the Seleucid kings. They thought they could eradicate centuries of faith and tradition by imposing Greek language, Greek gods, and Greek customs. In reality, however, they fanned the resistance fire. Every slight against the law strengthened the faithful's resolve. The will to resist was strengthened by every effort to place Zeus above Yahweh. Quiet conversations started in the countryside and villages. Craftspeople, farmers, and priests all spoke of rebellion and using weapons to preserve their identity rather than to conquer. Previously teaching their sons how to plow fields, fathers now started talking about courage, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. Once occasions for prayer and singing, the Sabbath gatherings evolved into spaces where defiance and faith coexisted. The seeds of an open revolt had been sown, but it was not yet complete. That seed was being nourished and growing in the hearts of the people with each slight against the covenant. Their sacred temple was desecrated, their holy city was crowded with idols, and they could see their children straying toward Greek ways. The weight of silence was too much to bear. To do nothing was to lose everything. Contradictions characterized the world prior to the uprising. At first glance, Hellenistic culture appeared to have won out. Greek theaters, gyms, and marketplaces were bustling with activity, while those who opposed lived in terror. However, something more powerful was establishing itself beneath that exterior. Despite being under constant pressure, the Jewish people retained a history of survival against powerful empires and a memory of deliverance. Egypt was no longer there. Babylon had collapsed. Persia had collapsed. Could Greece succumb to the resolve of a people who are devoted to their God as well? Their hearts ached from the weight of history and the covenant's promise. The Seleucids attempted to maintain a tenuous peace, and each act of oppression was another blow. When resistance would arise was now the question, not if it would. Families who fought between faith and survival would soon have to make decisions that would change not just their own future, but also the course of their country. The uprising was emerging from this furnace of pain and devotion in whispers, in silence, and in private prayers that God would one day send deliverers to restore his people and his law. Under the weight of foreign domination, the town of Modian sat silently, its residents treading carefully between devotion and survival. Rumors of rebellion had been rife in the Judean hills for years, but they were swiftly put down by the threat of Greek swords and the promises of riches for those who submitted to the new system. Mattathias, a priest of noble ancestry who lived in the center of that village, was closely linked to his father's customs by his ancestry. He was well known for his care for the populace, his wisdom in resolving conflicts, and his devotion to God. His sons reflected his strength, albeit in different ways, some quiet and unwavering, others fierce and restless, and his house served as a meeting place for those who were still clinging to the law. Because he represented a truth that could not be bought or coerced, he was respected by the populace. The decree of Antiochus arrived in Modian with the pomp of officials intent on asserting their power and the heavy footsteps of soldiers. They carried an altar that had been hurriedly constructed and desecrated with Zeus-related symbols. The directive was unambiguous. The populace was to honor Greek gods, give up their laws, and sacrifice in order to demonstrate their allegiance to the king. Most had already heard of scrolls being burned, leaders being put to death, and villages being destroyed for refusing. Mattathias remained steadfast despite the fear that hung over Modian like a storm cloud. He knew that this moment would determine whether his children would inherit faith or chains, and his heart ached as he watched for years as compromise eroded his people's faith. He was specifically chosen by the officials. They were aware that the rest of the village would bow if Mattathias, the revered priest, did. Under the pretense of threats, they persuaded him to lead his people in sacrifice by promising him protection, honor, and rewards. Their eyes were cold with calculation, but their words were sweet. Mattathias listened, stern-faced and filled with silent anger. With a voice that reverberated throughout the square, he declared that he and his household would uphold the covenant of their fathers, even if all nations obeyed the king. The authorities didn't leave. Rather frightened, another villager came forward to follow the command. Trembling, he reached for the sacrifice, desperate to betray his faith and save his life. Mattathias acted with such force in that moment that the crowd fell silent. Before the traitor could place the sacrifice on the altar, his hand struck him down. His blade was driven by holy fervor rather than personal animosity. The commanding soldier hurried to carry out the order, but Mattathias also retaliated against him. The altar was marred by the blood of those who attempted to desecrate it, and the square erupted in cries and confusion. It was an irrevocable act. Mattathias stood in the middle of the desecrated altar, his eyes burning, his chest heaving, the officials dead. The people saw a leader who was prepared to risk everything for the truth, even though he had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. Fear filled Modian's air. Everyone was aware that they would immediately face the king's wrath. With a look of both wonder and fear on their faces, Mattathias gathered his sons and said they could not stay. The mountains would be their haven, just as the wilderness and caves had once provided sanctuary to prophets. They ran away in the dark, leaving behind their house, their belongings, and the security of well-known streets. The only sounds during their trip were the thump of feet on uneven surfaces and the reverberation of inquiries that no one dared to voice out loud. Would they live? Would their people curse them for causing destruction, or would they join them? Mattathias was deeply hurt, but the decision was obvious. He was reminded of what was lost by each stone they passed. He was leaving more than just a home. He was leaving a community, a life of service, and the environment in which his kids had developed. The alternative, however, was unimaginable: to submit to idols and violate the covenant in order to gain short-term security. He was well aware of the price of following God, but he was also aware of the price of making concessions. Generations of people who were enslaved both physically and spiritually, a gradual death of the soul, and the erasure of a legacy. They were harshly embraced by the wilderness. The night was bitterly cold, and the rugged landscape provided no solace. They relied on what little they had and hoped that God, who had provided for their ancestors in the desert, would do so once more. Mattathias gazed at his sons, Jonathan, Judas, Eleazar, Simon, and John around the fire, and saw in them not only youth but also the seeds of future resistance. He addressed them with the solemnity of a man who was aware that his time was running out. His words, which exhorted them to stay faithful and be prepared to sacrifice themselves rather than break the law, were both foreboding and hopeful. There was fear and determination in those early mountain nights. Every shadow a soldier sent to crush their defiance, every rustle in the brush could have been the enemy looking for them. But a fire that was more brilliant than any torch grew inside their hearts. They were stewards of something eternal, not runaways from authority. They were also molded by the wilderness that threatened them, which replaced the tenderness of village life with the toughness of warriors. Judeans quickly learned of Mattathias's actions. It was a ray of hope for some. For others, it served as a chilling reminder of what faith can cost. Those who could stand the oppression no longer slowly moved into the mountains in search of Mattathias and his sons. They arrived with scrolls, cradled near their chests, weapons concealed beneath their cloaks, and hearts divided between bravery and fear. The wilderness evolved from a place of exile to a camp of resistance as each newcomer bolstered the cause. However, Mattathias never lost sight of the decision's consequences. He could feel his sons' gaze on him as they looked for assurance in the face of peril. He silently prayed, recalling the tales of David hiding from Saul, Moses running away into the desert, and Abraham leaving his home. They had experienced both God's deliverance and suffering along the way. He held fast to the conviction that his decision to oppose idolatry and brandish the sword in the name of holiness would not be in vain. Not just in Modian, but throughout Judea, the spark of defiance had been ignited. The blood that was spilled on a desecrated altar would soon turn into a fire that would be difficult for any empire to put out. Mattathias had no idea how many more battles were to come, or whether he would live to witness the triumph. However, he started a tale that would reverberate well beyond the Judean mountains when he made that initial act of refusal, when he decided to put himself in danger and go into exile rather than betray God. Following Mattathias's death, his son Judah assumed leadership, and the resistance was abruptly engulfed in a new kind of fire. The Greek forces had never encountered anyone like Judah. Ordinary villagers were inspired to become fearless warriors by the weight of his presence. His name, Maccabee, which translates to the hammer, became legendary very quickly. It was more than just a title. It was a representation of courage, strength, and unwavering force against oppression. In addition to calling their leader, his men's whispers of the hammer conjured a spirit of defiance that was unbreakable by numbers, swords, or fear. Judah realized what his father had started. He came to the realization that this struggle was about more than just survival after witnessing the destroyed villages, the scorched scrolls, and the desecrated altars. It had to do with his people's soul. Judah reminded them repeatedly that their battle was sacred. He spoke with such conviction that even the most reluctant farmer or shepherd felt like a soldier, not with empty hopes. His voice reverberated throughout the crowds, proclaiming that God was with them, that a small group of devoted men could overthrow an empire if they united with unwavering courage, and that the Greeks could take their homes but never their faith. With their disciplined ranks and well-armored soldiers, the Greeks misjudged the situation they were going into. They believed that without Mattathias, the rebellion would fall. Judah, however, declined to lead his people into combat where their meager numbers would be routed. Rather, he researched the terrain, the hills and the valleys where he had been raised. He was familiar with every rock, cavern and twisting trail. He transformed the forests into hiding places and the mountains into strongholds. They adopted guerrilla warfare as their tactic, and Judah was its leader. Judah trained his men in secret meetings at night. They were farmers, shepherds, and artisans rather than professional soldiers. Nevertheless, he taught them discipline, quiet, and accuracy. They developed the ability to move like shadows, strike swiftly, and disappear into the landscape before the adversary could react. Farm tools were transformed into weapons, wooden staffs were turned into spears, and any stone could be used as a weapon of resistance. During the day, the rebels remained hidden and blended into their villages, but at night they got together to sharpen their weapons, say prayers, and discuss plans for ambushes that would alter the trajectory of their conflict. The initial ambushes had a thunderous impact despite their small size. Confident in its armor and order, a Greek patrol would march through a narrow pass only to be confronted by a sudden shower of spears, arrows and stones thrown from the cliffs above. The orderly ranks disintegrated in the confusion of the terrain, and panic ensued. Before reinforcements could reach them, Judah's men quickly swooped down, struck precisely, and then vanished into the hills. Greek commanders were perplexed by these unexpected attacks. How were professional soldiers humiliated in this way by peasants who had so little equipment and training? Judah was aware that these triumphs, no matter how minor, were psychological warfare rather than merely military actions. His men gained confidence from each victory, which demonstrated to them that the powerful Seleucid Empire was not unbeatable. More men came forward to support Judah's cause, as word of these ambushes spread from village to village. The once fragile rebellion gained strength as Judea was swept by a surge of bravery and faith. As a sign that deliverance was imminent, mothers whispered the name Maccabee to their children. Judah's leadership was based on heart as much as strategy. Instead of walking above his men, he walked among them. He fought with them in the blood, and dust of every battle, ate what they ate and carried what they carried. His followers were bonded to him in unwavering loyalty by this intimacy. They saw Judah as a brother, a shepherd in their fight, and a man selected to bear the weight of freedom rather than as a distant commander. Before long, the Greeks realized they were up against something much more dangerous than a small group of insurgents. Judah's soldiers vanished like mist before more powerful armies could reach them, making it impossible to find them in the mountains or defeat them in open villages. As troops disappeared into ambushes, convoys were attacked and supply lines were severed. The Seleucid generals became irate. Greek troops, who had once marched with pride, began to feel fear. They started muttering about the hammer. The man who appeared out of nowhere, struck with unearthly accuracy, and disappeared before the sun rose. However, Judah's battle wasn't free. Every victory came with the burden of sacrifice, and every ambush meant putting lives in danger. He grieved with their families and stood over fallen comrades, men who had chosen to follow him into danger. He did, however, remind them that their blood was not wasted. Even though each loss was severe, it served as fuel for the resistance movement, inspiring the survivors to fight even harder and to remember the fallen by refusing to give up. The foundation of Judah's leadership continued to be his faith. He called his men to prayer before each assault, reminding them that the God who had saved their ancestors from Egypt was the source of their strength, not their numbers or weapons. The rebels were tethered to a history of miracles and triumphs over insurmountable odds by these prayers, which were more than just ceremonial rites. Judah's words lifted his men above their fear when they shuddered at the prospect of encountering armored soldiers. He would say, "We fight with the power of truth, not the power of armies. Furthermore, truth is more resilient than iron." The legend of Judah grew as the number of victories increased. Ballads of bravery were passed from town to town, and songs about the hammer started to be sung. His name became a beacon and a warning, a reminder to the Judeans that hope was alive, and a warning to the Greeks that oppression would be met with resistance. From a group of insurgents, his movement grew into an unstoppable force. Nevertheless, Judah was aware that the fight would only get more difficult. The Greeks were determined to respond to humiliation. He readied his men not only for the excitement of ambush, but also for the harsh realities of combat and the potential for the empire to wreak its full wrath on them. But he remained unflinching, despite the overwhelming odds. He firmly believed that God had selected this time, this conflict, and this people to rebel against oppression. The hammer of resistance pounded repeatedly in the Judean hills during the night. And with each blow, Judah Maccabee made his mark on history, not as a conqueror vying for fame, but as a leader bearing the burden of bravery, faith, and the unwavering spirit of a people who would not submit to oppression. Before the first blows of the uprising, there was an unusual silence in the Judean hills. The Seleucid armies believed that this rebellion would end swiftly, like a spark extinguished before flame, because they were confident in their size and equipment. However, Judah, the son of Mattathias, realized that fire spreads more quickly in arid fields, and his people had been devoid of hope for too long. In addition to hiding from the enemy, his small group of rebels were learning how to turn the land into their weapon as they ascended the ridges and hunkered down in the shadow of rocks. Unaware of what lay beyond, the Seleucid generals led their troops through treacherous passes. Wadi Haramia was more than just a valley of dust and stone. If one could learn to listen to the terrain, it became a stage where the weak could become strong. Judah told his men to wait. Every marching footstep and every clinking sound of armor reverberated up the pass's walls. The rebels bided their time until the enemy's line became vulnerable and slender. The mountain itself appeared to roar against the invaders as stones fell from cliffs, arrows whistled through the air, and there were sudden cries. Before swords even clashed, chaos swept through the ranks of the Seleucids. Uncertain of the attack's origin, soldiers stumbled over one another. For those who fought in it, it was everything, even though it wasn't a great battle by the standards of empires. Once only grieving, the rebels now held victory in their hands. They witnessed firsthand that the giants were prone to stumbling. Before the Seleucids could draw proper lines, Judah's men moved like shadows, striking quickly and vanishing. Having been accustomed to open fields where phalanxes stood shoulder to shoulder and cavalry thundered, the Seleucid generals were derided by hills that divided their formations. Smaller conflicts spread throughout the countryside after Wadi Haramia. These conflicts existed in the rumors of the peasantry, but did not find their way into the official records of the monarchs. Judah's warriors attacked lonesome hilltops close to vineyard trails and shepherd paths. They arrived at night or in the early morning when the ground was still covered in fog. Before the enemy even raised their shields, their arrows had already found their targets. Before a counterattack could be planned, they disappeared into caves and rolled boulders onto marching columns. For once, the foxes prevailed in the conflict. Between the lions and foxes, the impact was gauged not only by enemy casualties, but also by the rebels' growing self-confidence. Young men who had witnessed Seleucid haughtiness and now thought that haughtiness could bleed were added to the volunteer force with every battle. To pick up spears and slings, farmers set aside their plows, with staffs that could strike as hard as iron. Shepherds who had previously feared soldiers on the road joined Judah. Elders and women communicated secret messages between villages, provided food, and provided shelter for the injured. What started out as a small group of men hiding in the hills developed into a movement supported by a whole population. Judah himself evolved into a living symbol rather than just a leader. The rebels gathered around campfires to tell tales of how he fought like a God-selected warrior, how his sword shone brightly even in the dark, and how his voice had the power to calm fear. His name spread like wind through the olive groves, whispered from village to village, and traveled more quickly than his armies. Elders nodded proudly as children recited the stories. Their soldiers started to fear his name despite the Seleucid. Commanders' attempts to brush him off as a simple bandit. Rumors circulated in their camps about a man who was shielded by heaven itself, a warrior who struck out of the darkness and disappeared like smoke. With each setback, the Seleucid generals became increasingly frustrated. Instead of chasing bands of insurgents who turned hills into fortresses, they had been trained to fight against kings and organized armies. Every ridge seemed to conceal watchful eyes, and every valley seemed to conceal an ambush, rendering their maps of Judea useless. While Judah's men struck whenever they felt like it, they marched their soldiers in circles, exhausted and disheartened. Convoys were raided, supplies ran low, and discipline was weakened by fear. The commanders believed they were engaged in combat with an unstoppable, invisible foe. However, the triumphs were not just military in nature. They changed the Jewish people's soul. The recollection of destroyed temples and trampled liberties no longer brought hopelessness, but instead strengthened resolve. Judah reminded his followers that faith and guile, not sheer numbers, were what made them strong. His tactics made the ground itself an ally. The abrupt caverns, steep slopes, and winding roads provided shelter where it didn't seem possible. The rebels had mountains that bowed to their cause, while the Seleucids had war machines, armor, and horses. These early triumphs won belief in addition to territory, conviction that God had not abandoned them, that resistance was not insane, and that the rebellion was not doomed. The news that was spreading from Wadi Haramia and beyond made the villagers who had previously fled when they saw Seleucid patrols stand taller. Knowing that Judah was out there transforming minor conflicts into indications of a bigger promise caused even the most reserved farmers to feel a stirring of courage. Unable to comprehend what had changed, the Seleucids' frustration grew. These were minor skirmishes to them. They were sparks that ignited a fire that no army could put out for Judah and his people. The rebels understood the land, hunger, and hardship, but above all, they understood why they were fighting. The men of Judah fought for their homes, their families, and their faith. The Seleucids fought for conquest. Furthermore, no general can simply put out soldiers who are fighting with their hearts on fire. Before long, the name Judah Maccabee was more than just a rumor among rebels. It made its way through Judea's dusty streets, synagogues, and marketplaces. People talked about him as though he was already legendary, a fighter raised by divine will. Even though his victories were modest, they had significance outside of the battlefield, because they promised to make the impossible possible. And with each recounting, each cheer, and each step toward freedom, that promise once sown became stronger. The hills around Beth Horon were quiet at dawn, but every man gathered there knew that by nightfall, the earth would be stained with blood. One of the pivotal battles of the uprising took place in the rocky terrain, which featured steep passes and winding paths. Before his men stood Judah Maccabee, the youthful commander whose name had already started to evoke rumors of legend. Despite their small numbers, they had the expressions of men who had everything to defend and nothing left to lose as they marched under the Seleucid Greeks' banners. The rebels' weapons were crudely chiseled and frequently scavenged, while their adversary arrived in iron, their polished spears gleaming in the morning light. However, the fire of belief that burned through their veins was what ultimately decided their fate, not iron or numbers. When Judah raised his voice, the camp fell silent. Brothers, we fight today for the covenant that is written on our hearts, as well as for our land. Observe them, their armies resembling ocean waves. Who is their God, though? When death is near, who speaks for them? His words were more than just rhetoric. They spoke to the hearts of farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen who had come from their homes to support him. We fight not alone, for the God of our fathers is with us. Their fists clenched around the hafts of their weapons, and their hearts roared with bravery. Like a prayer, the sound of Judah's voice echoed through the mountain air. The conflict at Beth Horon developed rapidly. Confident in his superior force, the Seleucid commander pushed his men through the narrow pass. However, Judah had picked this location with care. The path was unable to withstand the full force of the Greek formations as the rocky cliffs closed in tightly. The rebels launched an unexpected avalanche of attacks as the first units of their phalanx entered. Arrows whistled through the air, rocks were flung from above, and warriors descended upon the stunned soldiers. As men stumbled and fell over each other, unable to move their long spears in the cramped area, panic swept through the Greek lines. What began as disciplined marching quickly descended into chaos. The ferocity of the rebels' movements belied their numbers. With cries that shook the hearts of their adversaries, they struck and disappeared into the darkness. The unrelenting attack tore apart the once confident Seleucid troops. Armed only with faith and rage, men who had been trained in years of combat now fled before farmers. The Greeks fled in embarrassment as the pass was covered in corpses by dusk. A motley crew of fanatics had humbled the powerful Seleucid army for the first time in living memory, and the news of their defeat swept the country like wildfire. Beth Horon had demonstrated that this uprising was a fire that no tyrant could put out with ease. However, the triumph did not lead to relaxation. Soon, a new storm was approaching. It was reported that Gorgias, a Seleucid general, was advancing with a sizable army with the intention of destroying Judah's army. Although the rebels were unable to confront them directly in an open field, Judah was aware that sometimes numbers could be more important than bravery. He came up with a plan that was both bold and desperate. Judah led a selected group of warriors in an unexpected march, leaving the campfires burning to fool the enemy, while Gorgias attempted to surprise them by night. Judah's men attacked the Seleucids' undefended camp as Gorgias stalked across the deserted camp, hoping to fall on dormant enemies. Fire sparked the Battle of Emmaus. Tents, supplies, and war chariots were set on fire, and the night sky was illuminated by torches. As soldiers fumbled in confusion and watched their own supplies burn in front of them, panic swept through the Greek camp. Judah's warriors surrounded them with cries that echoed throughout the valley when Gorgias returned to find his camp destroyed and his men disheartened. The clash of swords and the cries of men made the ground tremble. Despite being outnumbered, the rebels fought with the unbridled bravery of those who believed they were carrying out divine justice. Every thrust and strike was motivated by the need to defend the Holy Covenant, in addition to the need to survive. With his presence serving as a banner for his men, Judah himself fought in the middle. Before the battle, he said, "Do not be afraid of their numbers, for strength is not in the size of an army, but in the hand of the Almighty who defends the righteous." His words still reverberated. We are his warriors today, and even though the enemy is all around us, they will be defeated by the scythe. His soldiers had faith, and that faith changed the course of events. Faith propelled them forward, and they struck with a unity that rocked the orderly ranks of their enemies, where fear might have broken lesser men. The Seleucid armies had experienced victory in innumerable conflicts throughout the empire, but they were repeatedly humiliated here in the Judean hills. Their commanders, confident of victory, could not imagine how ill-prepared villagers could disperse their troops like dust. Emmaus evolved from a triumph to a symbol, a burning beacon of hope. The tales of Emmaus gave new life to those who had questioned the uprising. Men who prayed before battle and sang hymns while fighting had defeated the Greeks, despite their armored warriors and chariots. The story of the miracle was told by the battlefield itself. The rebels emerged wounded but victorious, amid the smoke of burning tents and the cries of the dying. Their pride was shattered, their supplies were gone, and their enemies were lying broken. The land that had moaned under oppression was now whispering that it was going to be saved. Once hiding in forests and caverns, men now walked with pride, their eyes bright with the promise of freedom. Judah's name was whispered to children by their mothers, who raised them as saviors rather than soldiers. Judah continued to remind his men that the war was far from over. Since the Greeks would return with larger numbers and the cost of freedom was never paid once but repeatedly, each victory was merely a step in a longer battle. However, the people had already internalized the lessons learned from Beth Horon and Emmaus. When confronted with unwavering faith, numbers and weapons are meaningless. Cities and temples could be destroyed by the Seleucids, but they couldn't destroy a people whose souls were ensnared in something timeless. More than just locations on a map, Beth Horon and Emmaus became indelible memories, evidence that the weak could defeat the strong, that faith could overthrow empires, and that devotion-driven bravery could bring the world's most arrogant armies to their knees. And with the unwavering conviction that heaven itself fought alongside them, Judah Maccabees' men prepared for the next phase of their uprising in the Judean hills, where the smoke was still rising and the ground still had the scars of combat. After years of intolerable oppression, the city of Jerusalem was eventually retaken, but it was more than just the return of stone gates, towers, and walls. It was the return of a people's heart. For many years, the most revered sites had been desecrated by foreign rulers who ridiculed the faith that had sustained generations. With the sounds of battle still reverberating in the air, rebellious soldiers marched through the city's streets, their sandals crushing the dust of a land that had bled under oppression. When men and women realized they were once again free to offer prayers to the God of their fathers, they paused to breathe in the ensuing deep silence, which was the sound of freedom rather than the loud roar of victory. Jerusalem no longer wore the garment of shame and was no longer a prison city. Even though it was scarred, it was once more in the possession of people who thought the God of Israel should be the primary owner. The rebels' hearts pounded quickly with both happiness and sorrow. They had prevailed, but at a high price. Families had been split up, friends had died in combat, and Judean soil had been tarnished by blood. The triumph was bittersweet, but not without sadness. They were aware that their work was far from done, because the temple, the location where heaven and earth met, was also home to the nation's soul. The temple was the lifeblood of Israel, if Jerusalem was its center. It had been polluted by sacrifices to false gods, desecrated and ridiculed by idols. Weary but unflinching, the rebels turned their steps toward the holy hill, where the name of God had once sat majestically. The scene they saw as they entered the temple pierced their souls more deeply than any sword could. The remains of filthy offerings tarnished the altar which had once been holy and pure. Where pilgrims had gathered with songs of praise, the courts now smacked of sacrilege and desertion. The golden menorah had been taken away, and holy vessels had been misplaced. or stolen. The sanctuary's stones themselves appeared to scream in agony, as if they were lamenting the humiliation and silence of what had been done. The priests who joined the rebels tore their clothes and poured their tears onto the soiled floor. They witnessed an attempt to eradicate their God, their faith, and their covenant, in addition to devastation and insult. But in the midst of the rubble, resolve emerged. The priests and rebels decided that this location would no longer be defiled. It would be purified, cleansed, and recommitted to the God who had saved them. They started the sacred work with urgency and reverence. The idols were destroyed, the foreign altars were demolished, and the stones that had been blackened by unholy fire were taken out. Water and prayer were used to wash, scrub, and purify the temple. Every action and gesture was carried out with the understanding that they were restoring a covenant rather than just cleaning a building. This was an act of worship and a declaration of faith that God was with them, not just human labor. The altar was rebuilt after the defilement was eliminated, up until there was once again a location where sacrifices could ascend to heaven in purity. New stones that had been carefully selected and untainted were placed one on top of another. Although the rebels were aware of their limited resources, the menorah, a symbol of eternal light, was ready. They looked frantically for oil that was pure and sealed in accordance with the sacred law, oil that had not been tainted by the enemy. Finally, a small vessel was discovered, but it was only enough for one day. Standing in such a magnificent, recently restored temple with only a day's worth of oil for God's lamp seemed almost mocking. However, faith has always outweighed reasoning. They lit the lamp and poured the oil with hope and prayer, choosing to put their faith in God instead of giving up on their lack. The temple's walls were illuminated by the flickering, tiny, but steady flame. People's hearts were lifted as they gathered. They knew they had contributed to the restoration of what was holy, even if the light only persisted for a single day. However, something unexpected happened. After the first day, the oil remained intact. The flame continued to burn on the second day, the third followed by the fourth. The priests expected to find the lamp extinguished each morning when they entered, but it continued to burn brightly. Wonder became reverence, and hope became wonder. The lamp persisted for 8 days in defiance of logic, confirming that the God of Israel was among them. The light was more than just oil and flame. It was a sign of divine approval, proving that their faith, sacrifice, and struggle had not been in vain. The oil miracle evolved into more than just a survival tale. It turned into a proclamation that no force on earth could extinguish the blaze of God's people. The covenant light would never go out, even if kings came and went, armies came and went, and empires roared and fell. It glowed for 8 days, long enough to prepare fresh oil and give the people time to realize that their rededication had been consecrated by heaven itself. As a result, Hanukkah emerged as a celebration of divine presence, light, and rebirth rather than just a commemoration of a military triumph. It evolved into the Festival of Lights, a time when families came together to light lamps and remember that God can create a lasting flame even in the most oppressive circumstances. Every generation was reassured by the flickering lights on the menorah that God's faithfulness would endure, serving as both a reminder of the past and a promise for the future. There were layers of meaning in the celebration. Yes, it was victory, but it was also a time of restoration, purification, and divine cooperation. It served as a reminder to the populace that holiness in worship must be matched with bravery in combat. Winning the city was insufficient. They also needed to take back the temple. Land ownership was insufficient. They also needed to protect the covenant. Hanukkah taught them and continues to teach us that light triumphs over darkness, that a single spark can expel hopelessness, and that faith can multiply what appears to be insufficient until it overflows. Future generations would assemble around the menorah and recount to children the Maccabees' story, the temple's purification, and the oil miracle. Fathers would describe how their forefathers overcame insurmountable obstacles. Mothers would tell their children that God's light would always shine, even in the midst of everything appearing corrupt and broken. The holiday was a practice of faith for the present and the future, not just for the past. As a result, Jerusalem once more stood as a city set free from foreign bonds and as a location where the eternal covenant was blazing brightly. The miracle of the oil and the temple's cleansing were combined into one testimony: God never deserts his people, and his light never goes out. That testimony gave rise to the Hanukkah celebration, which has endured for centuries with its aroma of courage, hope, and divine faithfulness. Every flame lit in remembrance of those 8 days still whispers the same timeless truth, that ultimately light will always triumph over darkness, even though empires would continue to rise and fall. Following his early triumphs over the Seleucid Empire, Judah Maccabee's journey reached its most tragic yet inspirational juncture. At first, he had done the seemingly impossible with his small army of loyal followers. They had repeatedly resisted bigger armies, which were composed of warriors, and supported by the riches and assets of a powerful empire. The Judean people gained courage from each victory, which demonstrated to them that even the most formidable enemies could be defeated by faith, tenacity, and a refusal to submit to oppression. But with each victory, the Seleucid court paid more attention to Judah and his men. After suffering humiliating setbacks, the empire started to muster all of its might to put an end to the uprising for good. The uprising could no longer be put down by sending regional garrisons and local governors. Judah's resistance was now viewed by the empire as a danger to its authority and prestige. Larger armies under the command of seasoned leaders were ready and marched into Judea with the intention of destroying Judah's army as well as the Jewish people's very hope of independence. Judah's last and most desperate campaign began with this escalation. Judah refused to give up in the face of overwhelming odds. His whole struggle had been based on the conviction that he could not give up. For him, surrendering to the Seleucid kings meant more than just losing politically. It meant losing their people's sacred traditions, being betrayed by God, and dying spiritually. Even as their numbers decreased, his men remained faithful because they were moved by his bravery. Even though there were few reinforcements and many fighters who had lost their lives in previous conflicts, Judah resisted giving up. His leadership evolved into a spiritual focal point rather than just a military tactic. Judah readied his men for the impending battle as he learned that the Seleucids were advancing with thousands of soldiers, much more than he could possibly hope to face head-on. Both they and he were aware of the odds. In his speeches, however, he emphasized the successes they had already achieved and the numerous instances in which they had defeated superior forces. He reminded them that numbers weren't the only way to gauge their strength. Their courage was unfailing, their faith unwavering, and their cause righteous. They were united as brothers, prepared to face the storm by these words, which propelled them forward. When the Seleucid army arrived, their force must have resembled a moving sea of war elephants, spears, and shields. Judah's resistance seemed doomed from the start to the outside observer. History, however, demonstrates that Judah remained steadfast. He attacked with audacity, hitting the enemy in unexpected places. He was aware that his men's morale would be crushed by any hesitation or retreat. Despite having to retreat, Judah used the setbacks as a chance to reorganize and launch another attack. Judah demonstrated a ferocity in these final conflicts that was remembered for generations. He held back the Seleucid tide longer than anyone thought possible by using terrain, timing, and the sheer will of his fighters, despite being outnumbered at every turn. However, the empire's constant pressure could not be stopped indefinitely. The Battle of Elasa was the pivotal conflict. With just a few hundred men, Judah had to contend with a sizable Seleucid army under the command of generals determined to put an end to his rebellion. Even before the fighting started, the field was uneven. The Seleucids had the advantage of numbers, cavalry, and heavily armed infantry. Judah had no hope of reinforcements, fewer weapons, and exhausted men. Nevertheless, he entered the fight with the same fervor that had propelled him to every triumph. He fought with unparalleled bravery, according to witnesses, as if he were already accepting his fate, but resolved to leave his mark on history with each blow of his sword. Following his lead, his men charged into the center of the enemy lines. With him, unwilling to retreat despite the danger, the fight was vicious. The Seleucids were taken aback by Judah's ferocious attack and their readiness to die rather than flee. The smaller force held its ground for hours, slicing through enemy ranks and leaving chaotic scenes in its wake. Instead of hiding behind his men, Judah himself fought at the front. His bravery served as the battle's lifeblood, the impetus that kept his outnumbered fighters fighting against insurmountable odds. But the sheer weight of numbers was too strong for any amount of bravery to overcome. The Seleucid lines closed in slowly. One by one, Judah's men started to fall, until there were just a few left. Judah continued to fight despite being surrounded on all sides, his sword flashing as his strength diminished. Finally, he was hit and fell in the middle of the battle, his body shattered but his spirit unwavering. His passing swiftly became known, bringing a dark cloud to Judea. Many believed that the rebellion's core had been torn out. The ensuing grief was severe. Judah was more than just a military commander. He was a living example of resistance and a testament to the power of one man's bravery and faith to unite a nation. Although his passing shocked the populace, it also gave rise to inspiration. The Seleucids unintentionally produced a martyr whose legacy would inspire not only his own generation, but innumerable others to come, rather than stifling the Jewish people's will. The Maccabean cause did not perish with Judah. Instead, his brothers continued the fight he had started. The story of Judah's final stand at Elasa was recounted and retold in synagogues, villages, and family get-togethers. He faced the greatest army of his time without flinching, according to his parents. Young people would be reminded by elders that his sacrifice was not in vain because it demonstrated to the world that faith could triumph over fear and courage, could outlast conquest. The dream of freedom was not dashed by his passing. Rather, it was strengthened by his heroism and given new life. In retrospect, Judah Maccabee's downfall was more than just the death of a leader. It was the turning point in his struggle into something timeless. His bravery became a yardstick by which succeeding generations would evaluate themselves. He demonstrated that persevering against insurmountable odds, even to the point of death, was a triumph in and of itself. While the Seleucids saw the battle as a military victory, the Jewish people saw Judah's sacrifice as the cornerstone of their spirit and a reminder that bravery was something that could never be fully overcome. His tale is still relevant today, centuries later, as a timeless lesson. His passing marked the start of a resilient legacy that taught that one man's defiance of defeat can illuminate the path for a whole people. Judah Maccabee's sacrifice was never forgotten, and wherever freedom and faith are valued, his unwavering bravery endures. Many people's hopes were dashed when Judas Maccabeus was killed in combat, but the fight continued after his passing. Refusing to let the dream of a free and loyal country die, his brothers Jonathan and Simon continued the torch. Despite not being as well known at first, Jonathan showed himself to be a wise and understanding leader. He recognized the need to strike a balance between force and wisdom. rather than just charging into battle to regain lost territory. Large and capable of overwhelming with sheer might, the Seleucid Empire was also shattered by internal conflicts. Jonathan took advantage of those cracks, realizing that diplomacy was just as important to survival as swords and spears. Jonathan's initial years as leader were unstable. It was necessary to re-energize and boost the morale of the Jewish combatants, who were exhausted from the ongoing fighting. Instead of engaging in direct combat that could result in annihilation, Jonathan reorganized the forces and directed them towards smaller, more strategic attacks against Seleucid positions. The Maccabean style of warfare was still characterized by guerrilla warfare, which included ambushes, surprise attacks, and retreats into the hills. The enemy was never given a chance to relax or think that Judas's death had put an end to the Jewish uprising. Through his leadership, Jonathan demonstrated that, although his brother had exhibited bravery and zeal, he himself possessed tenacity and cunning. Jonathan started participating in the bigger political game at the same time. Rival claimants battled for control of the empire, and the Seleucid rulers were mired in succession disputes. When it suited his agenda, Jonathan prudently sided with one faction. However, when the political tide turned, he switched sides. He started to present himself as a respectable actor whose backing could tip the scales in the empire's civil wars, rather than just as a rebel. His adversaries, who had previously derided him as an uncooperative rebel, soon realized they required his assistance. From a hunted guerrilla leader to a well-known figure on the Hellenistic world stage, this was a remarkable change. Jonathan, however, never left the resistance's core. He and his men protected Jewish villages from attacks, built strongholds, and guarded supply routes. Wherever they could, the Seleucid commanders burned, pillaged, and enslaved the countryside in their ruthless campaigns. Jonathan, however, responded to every act of brutality with fortitude, preserving the spirit that no empire could completely crush. His men developed into survival experts who fought to protect their families and faith, in addition to securing territory. Every conflict, no matter how minor, turned into a proclamation that Jews would not bow. Eventually, Jonathan received official recognition from the Seleucid kings, who gave him titles and powers as a military commander and high priest. This recognition was a result of necessity rather than kindness. He was viewed by them as a stabilizing force who could maintain order in Judea while they fought their larger conflicts. However, this moment marked a significant change for the Jewish people. Their leader was being recognized as a ruler in his own right, not just as someone who was rebelling against the empire. It seemed as though the long-nurtured dream of independence was finally starting to materialize in the open. Jonathan faced difficulties during his years as a leader. His resolve was put to the test by betrayal, changing allegiances, and ongoing combat. He was eventually taken prisoner and murdered by adversaries who wished to put out the resistance once more. However, by that point, the cause was too powerful to be undone by one man's death. His brother Simon was given the torch once more, and he continued it with the same tenacity that had characterized the Maccabean family from the start. Simon took a different tack than his brothers. Simon was a foundation builder, whereas Jonathan had been a patient strategist and Judas had been a warrior of fire. In addition to ensuring that Jewish autonomy was maintained through military means, he sought to build on the progress that had already been made. His leadership established the framework for something more durable than rebellion, a functional, autonomous Jewish state, by combining unwavering resistance with cautious governance. Guerrilla warfare was still crucial under Simon, but he also fortified castles and brought about law and order. Despite the ongoing threats, the rhythms of daily life returned. Villages started to breathe easier, and farmers plowed their fields with less fear. Simon was unrelenting in his defense of the populace, but the stability he was able to establish was more important to his success than the quantity of battles he won. For the first time in many generations, people felt that freedom was a real thing rather than just a pipe dream. Like Jonathan before him, Simon recognized that diplomacy could be just as effective as the sword. Through his negotiations with the surrounding powers, he was able to secure recognition of Jewish independence from both Rome and the weakened Seleucid rulers. This was a pivotal moment of great importance. What had started as a desperate uprising gained legitimacy when Rome, the rising giant of the Mediterranean world, recognized the value of Jewish self-rule. The Jews were a people with their own government, their own state, and their own fate. They were no longer just rebels hiding in hills and caves. Simon's leadership was now bringing the dream that had started with Mattathias's defiance and Judas's bravery to life. It was a remarkable shift from resistance fighters to acknowledged rulers. All of the sacrifices made and the lives lost during the struggle now appeared to have come together in this triumphant moment. When they saw that faith, tenacity, and bravery had created a place for freedom in an empire-ruled world, the people who had once felt hopeless over the destruction of their temple now walked with a certain amount of pride. The Hasmonean dynasty was established during Simon's reign, bringing about the accomplishment of the goals his father and brothers had battled for. Although greater powers were always a threat, independence was neither complete nor permanent. But the change was evident. The Jewish people had gone from oppression to self-government, from despair to a future they could start to control. In addition to being a warrior, Simon was regarded as a leader who made the ideal of freedom tangible for his people to see, feel, and inhabit. What started out as an urgent protest against oppression had developed into a legacy that would last. Jonathan and Simon made sure that Judas's passing was a turning point towards something bigger rather than the story's conclusion. Their combined efforts, Simon's stability and recognition, Jonathan's diplomacy and perseverance, brought their people's cause to a level no one would have thought possible when the Maccabees first spoke out against injustice. In the heart of Judea, the dream shone brighter than ever after enduring the trials of betrayal, the grief of loss, and the fire of persecution. The Maccabee family's valiant bravery in rising from obscurity during one of the darkest periods in Jewish history is where the story of the Hasmonean dynasty begins. Their struggle stemmed from their survival and faith, not from a desire for power. Judas Maccabeus and his brothers were the ones who refused to give up when Antiochus IV of the Seleucid Empire destroyed the temple in Jerusalem and made Judaism illegal. Through bold strategy, unwavering determination, and strong conviction, their small group of rebels defeated the region's most powerful empire and reclaimed Jerusalem, purified the temple, and recommitted it to God. The festival of Hanukkah, a representation of faith and defiance in the face of insurmountable odds, immortalized this triumph. However, what started out as a rebellion to defend freedom and faith quickly expanded into something more significant, and the Maccabees went from being resistance fighters to becoming a kingdom's rulers. At the start of their uprising, the Maccabees' father Mattathias had no political aspirations. Their ancestry bound them to the temple and its service. They were priests. However, Judas Maccabeus' brothers Jonathan and Simon continued the fight after his death, ultimately securing both freedom and independence. The Hasmonean dynasty, named for a family ancestor, emerged from the Jewish state that the Maccabees were able to establish after the Seleucids were weakened by internal conflict. In addition to their temple, the Jewish people had their own kings and priests for the first time in centuries. The ability to rule themselves, practice their religion freely, and retake their territory without external intervention was a dream long suppressed under foreign empires and was realized under the Hasmonean state. The Hasmoneans were hailed as heroes in the early years of their reign. They united national independence and religious devotion in a way that resonated strongly with their people. Despite not coming from the Zadok priestly line, Jonathan took on the position of high priest, a choice that would later come under fire. But stabilizing the new country required his leadership. The Hasmonean line of government was formally established when his brother Simon succeeded him and assumed the roles of high priest and ruler. This combination of political and priestly authority was viewed by many Jews as divinely mandated, the continuation of God's favor for those who had put their lives in danger to protect his name. The Hasmonean kings, however, started to evolve. As the generations went by, the passion that had spurred the uprising against Antiochus gradually waned, and the temptations of riches, conquest, and political scheming replaced it. Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, waged vigorous campaigns to enlarge the Hasmonean kingdom, compelling the local populace to either convert to Judaism or face enslavement. His policies created divisions, both inside and outside of Judea, despite the fact that he militarily strengthened the state. Many pious Jews were troubled by his successors' continued blending of faith and political ambition. Once known for its unadulterated faith and opposition to foreign dominance, the movement started to look more and more like the very forces it had fought against. Additionally, the Hasmoneans became intertwined with the Mediterranean world's larger political scene. Rome, which at the time was becoming a dominant power, was the target of their alliances. These connections were initially practical measures to protect against external threats. However, Rome's influence in Judean affairs grew over time, hinting at the eventual loss of independence. Despite their pride in their dynasty, the Hasmoneans were unable to withstand the influence of larger empires indefinitely. Their tale illustrates the larger conflict faced by tiny countries in antiquity, striking a balance between preserving their independence and figuring out how to survive among giants. Additionally, the dynasty's internal politics grew more tense. Rival heirs invited outside powers to step in on their behalf, and disputes over succession turned brothers against one another. Once a source of strength, the union of royal and priestly authority now became a point of contention. Hasmonean policies frequently caused conflict between the two main Jewish sects, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, especially when it came to the rulers' legitimacy as high priests. Since the Hasmoneans were not descended from the line of Zadok, their claim to the priesthood was never entirely accepted by everyone, which weakened their religious authority despite their political power. Alexander Jannaeus, a Hasmonean king, whose disputes with the Pharisees descended into violence, is a notable example of this decline. Many of his opponents were crucified by him, which was shocking for a ruler who professed to uphold Israel's religious beliefs. The kingdom reached its largest territorial expansion during his rule, but at the expense of internal conflict and escalating animosity. The conflicts between religious communities and political power were difficult to resolve, despite his widow, Salome Alexandra, who succeeded him, trying to mend these wounds by re-establishing the Pharisees' influence. More concerned with maintaining their power than with preserving the ideals that initially spurred their uprising, the later Hasmoneans grew more and more decadent. Eventually, the dynasty was further undermined by civil wars between competing claimants, and Rome was called upon to mediate conflicts. This turned out to be the fatal error. Roman rule over Judea began in 63 BCE when Pompey the Great invaded Jerusalem. Although the Hasmonean dynasty was still in name, Romans now held actual power. The outcome of what had started out as a valiant uprising against foreign oppression was submission to an empire that was far more powerful than the Seleucids ever were. The legacy of the Hasmoneans is complex. On the one hand, they were regarded as liberators, the family that rededicated the temple and reinstated Jewish sovereignty. Their triumphs served as a testament to human bravery and divine intervention, motivating generations to honor their defiance. However, their rule demonstrated how easily even the most devoted can be corrupted by power. After starting out as a dynasty founded on devotion, it gradually descended into factionalism, tyranny, and compromise. Once viewed as a blessing, the union of the priesthood and the kingship eventually caused division in the country, as various factions questioned their validity. However, the Hasmoneans changed Jewish history in spite of their shortcomings. They proved that faith could inspire nations, that courage could alter the course of history, and that resistance could lead not only to survival, but also to independence. Their dynasty established the framework for the conflicts that would characterize Judea under Roman control by bridging the gap between the era of prophecy and the world of empires. Even though their reign was unsuccessful, the tale of their ascent and decline endures as a timeless reminder of how those in positions of power are changed by them, and how even the most devoted people need to resist the temptations of power. One of the most turbulent and valiant periods of Jewish history begins when we enter the writings known as the Books of Maccabees. These texts, which have been passed down through the ages in different forms, are more than just historical narratives. They carry within them the unwavering spirit of a people who refuse to be broken, the cry of faith, and the pulse of courage. To comprehend them is to see how conviction gave rise to resistance and how the fight for identity and worship evolved into the hallmark of survival. As though four voices were assembled around a single event, each narrating what they saw, felt, or were moved to write, each book offers us a unique perspective on the same story. Known simply as 1 Maccabees, the first book reads almost like a chronicle of a soldier. It focuses on history in the most useful sense, has a straightforward tone, and is meticulous in its details. It begins with attempts to eradicate Jewish tradition, the emergence of foreign oppression, and the courageous resistance of the Hasmoneans, a priestly family from the town of Modine. It documents conflicts, tactics, and the tenacious will of Judah Maccabee and his brothers, who resisted allowing foreign rulers to destroy their people's covenant with God. In contrast to subsequent retellings, 1 Maccabees does not dwell on visions or miracles for very long. Rather, it insists on remembering the true cost of war, the bloodshed, the sacrifices made, and the cities protected for the sake of the temple and the law. The text is written in Greek, which mirrors the world in which the Jews found themselves, dominated by Hellenistic culture, but fiercely defending their own, rather than Hebrew, which influenced so many of Israel's earlier writings. For many, 1 Maccabees is the most unadorned, yet most memorable account of Jewish valor. Maccabees, on the other hand, presents a distinct kind of story that is infused with the supernatural and spiritual. Although it discusses many of the same events, such as the desecration of the temple, the oppression under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and the rebellious uprising, it does so with a greater sense of purpose and moral significance. In contrast to 1 Maccabees, which concentrated on the actions of warriors, 2 Maccabees illuminates the faith of common believers, especially those who chose to suffer martyrdom rather than violate the law. The torture of 7 brothers and their mother, who refused to eat forbidden food and instead chose to die with dignity, is described in one of the most moving episodes. Their voices, as they are preserved in the text, fervently pray that God will reward their perseverance and that their sacrifice will not go unappreciated. This book also focuses on divine intervention, showing how heaven appeared to defend the faithful, sometimes through angelic appearances, visions, or inexplicable victories. In contrast to Maccabees' stark realism, the supernatural is interwoven throughout history here, reminding readers that the conflict was never only political, but also profoundly spiritual. Beyond these two more well-known stories, which are included in Catholic and Orthodox canons, but not in the Protestant Bible, are the Maccabees 3 and 4, which are texts that are frequently overlooked in the West, but are still a part of the Ethiopian and some Eastern Orthodox Bibles' larger traditions. 3. Despite its title, Maccabees does not directly carry on the Hasmonean revolt story. Instead, it describes how Jews were persecuted in Egypt under a different ruler, Ptolemy IV. There are dramatic scenes in the story where Jewish people are saved by divine intervention after being threatened with extinction by drunken elephants. This story is centered on divine deliverance rather than military bravery. The narrative demonstrates how faith and providence continued to be the Jewish people's lifeline, even when they were far from Jerusalem, echoing the same theme of survival in the face of overwhelming odds. The Book of 3 Maccabees became a potent reminder to readers in diasporic communities that God's protection transcended national boundaries. 4 Maccabees, however, adopts yet another strategy. This text is more of a philosophical analysis of the significance of the events than it is a narrative history. It makes a strong case for the superiority of pious, reason-driven reason over the passions of the flesh, with roots in the Jewish Hellenistic world where philosophy and faith collided. It elevates the martyrdom stories from 2 Maccabees into a contemplation of what it means to live and die for divine law. Once again, the 7 brothers and their mother are highlighted, but this time their deaths are not only viewed as heroic deeds, but also as the ultimate demonstration that even the most terrible suffering can be overcome by self-control, devotion, and loyalty to God. Thus, Maccabees turns history into moral philosophy, providing future generations with lessons to follow in addition to stories to admire. These 4 books collectively provide a complex and nuanced testimony. By keeping us rooted in history, Maccabees makes sure that the actions of the Hasmonean family and their allies will never be forgotten. By demonstrating how common believers gave the uprising a purpose beyond politics, 2 Maccabees takes us into the spiritual center of the conflict, by reminding Jews of the diaspora that their hardships were also a part of the larger narrative of survival, and that God's hand was at work even in strange places. 3 Maccabees broadens the perspective. 4. Maccabees transforms the tales of suffering into timeless meditations on faith, virtue, and reason. These accounts do not negate each other, rather, they enhance each other, providing a chorus of voices that collectively convey the completeness of the Maccabean witness. Beyond their historical context, these books are significant. In the centuries that followed, they came to represent bravery and loyalty for Jewish communities. These events, the rededication of the temple following its defilement, are the foundation of Hanukkah celebrations. However, the books do more than merely describe a celebration. They perpetuate the idea that identity is maintained via sacrifice as well as triumph. From early Christians who saw in them a foreshadowing of their own endurance under persecution to later generations who took strength from their example, the martyr's willingness to die rather than compromise became a model for countless others. These books present us with issues that are just as important today as they were 2 millennia ago. When under pressure to fit in, what does it mean to stay faithful? When strong forces try to eradicate a community's identity, how do they maintain it? What kind of bravery is required to stand, fight, or even die for the truth that one believes in? This is perhaps the most important question. These questions are not addressed in a cohesive manner in the books of Maccabees. Rather, they offer the reader a mosaic of meaning to ponder by presenting history, miracle, diaspora testimony, and philosophy. History is never just one story, as these writings' hidden testimonies demonstrate. Depending on who is telling it, it is remembered differently, and each telling gives the truth a new dimension. The Maccabees were seen by the Jewish people as symbols of perseverance as well as historical heroes. And for anyone who reads these texts, their tales serve as a reminder that bravery is a gift that never goes out of style. It is a timeless quality that is captured in words, carried in memory, and ready to encourage anyone who is looking for the fortitude to stick by their principles in the face of adversity. Some stories disappear under the ebb and flow of history, not because they were unimportant, but rather because influential people made decisions about which memories would live on and which would be forgotten. One of those stories is the story of the Maccabees, which was once essential to Jewish identity, later preserved in some Christian traditions, but was methodically excluded from the mainstream Western Bible. The Maccabees' exclusion from the majority of Bibles was not an accident. It was a conscious act, influenced by political conflicts, theological disagreements, and the desire to reinterpret what was considered sacred. At its core are the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther's broad challenge to the Catholic Church, and the centuries of fallout that followed his rejection of the Apocrypha. One must first acknowledge the importance of the Maccabean books in order to comprehend this erasure. These texts describe a fiery period in Jewish history when common people rebelled against powerful foreign powers. With its vicious efforts to exterminate Jewish traditions and impose Hellenistic culture, the Seleucid Empire appeared to be unstoppable. Judas Maccabeus and his family, however, rose up against this oppression and led an uprising that saved their faith during a crisis and restored the Jewish temple. The Maccabees' books were more than just battle chronicles for generations. In the face of cultural destruction, they exemplified defiance, bravery, and a strong faith in God. They were a combination of inspiration and history. However, this story's very strength made it susceptible to being suppressed when new forces attempted to reinterpret the Bible. One of the biggest upheavals in European religious history was the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. A movement that questioned Rome's authority was started by Martin Luther, a German monk who became disenchanted with the Catholic Church's practices, particularly the indulgence trade. However, Scripture was also a factor in Luther's uprising, in addition to corruption and theology. The question of which books actually belonged in the Bible was at the center of his campaign. Luther maintained that the Hebrew Scriptures, which excluded the Apocrypha, a compilation of works preserved in the Greek Septuagint, should be more closely aligned with the Old Testament. The Maccabees' books were one of these excluded texts. Luther rejected the Apocrypha, arguing that it was helpful but not inspired by God. He famously marked them as not equal to the Holy Scriptures in a separate section of his German Bible, casting doubt on their authority. Later Protestant reformers went even farther and removed them completely from their printed Bibles. Once respected, the Maccabees were now marginalized. This was more than just a religious position. It represented their understanding of faith. This purification, which included the removal of Maccabees, would influence Protestant identity for centuries to come. But Catholicism followed a different course. The Catholic Church formally reaffirmed the Apocrypha's inclusion and declared them to be part of the canon at the Council of Trent in 1546, in direct response to Protestant objections. The stories of the Maccabees were still taught, remembered, and connected to religious rites and remembrance in Catholic Bibles. In addition to the Maccabees, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved a much wider canon that included writings that were unfamiliar to the majority of Western Christians. Ethiopian believers still possess a much larger collection of sacred texts that have not been trimmed by Western reformers. The Maccabees were never lost in these customs. However, the decision to exclude these books had long-lasting effects throughout much of the Western world, especially in Protestant countries. Generations were raised unaware of the Jewish people's fight for independence from Greek rule. Though it lost its biblical context for Christians, the story of Hanukkah, which is closely linked to the Maccabean revolt, became a holiday celebrated in Judaism. A sort of collective amnesia was cultivated by the omission. In the pages of most Bibles, the brave men who battled not only for survival, but also for the right to worship were forgotten, and their bravery was replaced by silence. Theology itself was influenced by Maccabees' expulsion. According to Catholic tradition, the books contained passages that supported ideas that Protestants disapproved of, like saints' intercession and prayers for the deceased. Reformers could more readily destroy teachings they disagreed with by removing the Maccabees. In a way, the rejection of these books was about controlling the narrative of what Christianity should and shouldn't believe, in addition to their historical content. Thus, the erasure of this history was both political and spiritual. The West progressed without them for centuries. Preachers, scholars, and regular Christians all read their Bibles without realizing that entire historical periods had been omitted. Although their absence was felt, the Maccabees were rarely mentioned in sermons or religious imagination. Nevertheless, the memory persisted in the darkness. The story was still told in Catholic and Orthodox traditions. Naturally, Jewish communities continued to commemorate the uprising and celebrated Hanukkah as a festival of resiliency and light. Unaffected by Western disputes, Ethiopia preserved the texts in its extensive canon. The Maccabees had just been concealed from the view of those influenced by Protestant tradition. They were no longer there. However, there has been a resurgence of interest in the Bible's lost books in recent years. Questions about why some books vanished and what was lost when they did have started to arise among academics, seekers, and regular readers. Rediscovering the Maccabees is a profound reflection on faith, sacrifice, and identity, in addition to being a story of war. They are witnessing the cross-cultural and cross-historic resonance of the tale of one oppressed people struggling for their lives. It serves as a reminder that Scripture covers both divine revelation and the human struggles that sustain it. The Western belief that its Bible is comprehensive is also called into question by the rediscovery of the Maccabees. It calls into question the extent to which political choices, rather than divine decree, shaped much of what believers take for granted. What else has been erased, reinterpreted, or silenced if the Maccabees could disappear from Protestant Bibles? This makes some people want to go back to more expansive canons and interpret these writings as crucial evidence of faith's ability to endure under duress, rather than as oddities. Others see it as merely a means of rediscovering the depth of a past that is not exclusive to any one religion, but rather to the history of humanity. The Maccabees regain their status as symbols of faith and resistance as the hidden past is revealed. Once more, centuries of conflict and reformation led to their disappearance, which was no coincidence. However, their resurgence due to renewed research and cultural memory serves as a reminder that truth tends to come to light again. In the minds of people who want to know the whole story of their faith, as well as in dusty libraries, what was once erased is now being written back into history. The Maccabees story is much more than just an old tale preserved in the annals of history. It is a living example of the resilience of identity, hope, and faith in the face of overwhelming adversity. Celebrated with prayers and glowing candles, Hanukkah is more than just a way to remember a previous miracle. It serves as a universal reminder that light can shine through even the darkest situations. For the Jewish people, Hanukkah symbolizes a time when hope was stronger than despair, when the weak defeated the strong, and when the few triumphed over the many. However, it is a tale that speaks to the core of human resiliency and transcends religion and culture for the global community. Judah Maccabee, a timeless figure, is at the heart of this tale. He didn't come from a wealthy family or have the support of a large army or empire. His unwavering belief that his people should be allowed to live freely without having their customs or their God forgotten is what made him legendary. Judah's bravery exemplifies the timeless archetype of the underdog who will not give up, the warrior who fights for the survival of truth rather than for glory or conquest. His name has become synonymous with defiance and the kind of fire that motivates future generations to rebel against oppression despite all odds because of his resistance against one of the most powerful empires of his era. The lessons that the Maccabees impart to us are not confined to the past. Rather, they are still relevant today. Their narrative exemplifies faith that perseveres when victory appears unattainable. They serve as a reminder that bravery is the choice to proceed in spite of fear, not the absence of it. They demonstrate to us the price of sacrifice, because identity and freedom are never inexpensive. The road to freedom was paved with blood and hardship, families were split apart, and lives were lost. However, the Maccabees' victory serves as a reminder that when sacrifice is made to preserve honor and truth for future generations, it is never in vain. Ritual is not the only thing visible in the menorah's flickering lights. Every flame represents tenacity and the will to resist the urge to fit in with the crowd. Lighting that flame was an act of rebellion and a declaration that the Jewish people living under the Seleucid Empire's shadow would not be silenced. The same idea still applies today whenever people or groups decide to maintain their identity. In the face of social, cultural, or political pressures, the similarities are remarkable when we consider the modern world. Although it can take many different forms, oppression always aims to deprive people of their freedom, dignity, and voice. The spirit of the Maccabees endures in local communities battling racism, in countries fending off foreign dominance, and in people speaking out against injustice and corruption. Their example makes us consider whether we will have the strength to resist when the pressure to give in becomes too great. Will we have the same faith as Judah that even a small contingent of the faithful can resist in the face of overwhelming odds? The Maccabees' tale also serves as a reminder to safeguard one's identity in a society that is always pressuring us to fit in. The forces of assimilation are strong, regardless of the source, personal values, religious customs, or cultural traditions. However, the Maccabees serve as a reminder that clinging to one's heritage is a form of resistance in and of itself. We must preserve what makes us special: our languages, our stories, our beliefs, and our communities, just as they resisted allowing Greek influence to erase their heritage. The Maccabees warn us of the cost of silence and the difficulty of regaining one's identity once it has been lost. This story also teaches us the value of modest beginnings. Judah and his supporters were outnumbered, outgunned, and undervalued. When they initially took up arms, they were certain of what was right, but not of victory. Their bravery transformed their weakness into strength, and their meager numbers into a force that altered the course of history. This teaches us that the powerful are not always the ones who initiate change in our own lives. It starts with one brave act, one step, or one choice to resist. Every tiny act of bravery, Whether it be speaking the truth in the face of lies, protecting a weak neighbor, or confronting injustice at work, contributes to a greater movement that has the power to change the world. However, the Maccabees' tale is more than just a tale of conflict or uprising. It's also about the endurance miracle. When people dedicate themselves to righteousness, even nature seems to bend in their favor, as symbolized by the oil that burned for 8 nights when there was only enough for one. The unexpected victory that demonstrates that hope is never in vain. The silent persistence of light in the darkest night and the survival of faith when all else seems lost are examples of miracles that are not always grand spectacles. It is evident that the Maccabees' legacy belongs to us, here and now, rather than just the past. The Maccabees rise again whenever people defend their traditions, fight for their freedom, and choose light over darkness and faith over fear. The struggles of our time, the battle against injustice, the bravery of those who do not give up, and the flame that will not go out are all interwoven with their story. Therefore, we shouldn't consider the Hanukkah story to be remote or limited to history books. Let us view it as a challenge to live bravely, to defend our identity, to stand up for what is right, and to have faith that light will always triumph over darkness, no matter how overwhelming the odds may be. The Maccabees' story is about us right now, not just about the past. And I encourage you to move forward if this story has moved you, or if it has given you a fresh perspective on the old story of Judah Maccabee. Please support our efforts by subscribing to this channel, sharing this story so that others can draw strength from it, and helping us unearth more biblical hidden tales that have relevance to our lives today. Which Maccabees lesson most resonates with you? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Watch the relevant videos we've prepared for you when you're ready. They each tell a different tale of resiliency, faith, and truth that is just waiting to be unearthed. After all, these tales are not merely archaic. They are still relevant today, influencing, motivating, and reminding us of our true selves. What happens when faith itself is outlawed? Imagine waking up one morning and finding that the prayers your ancestors taught you are now crimes, that your sacred traditions, the very heartbeat of your people, have been declared illegal. The songs that once gave you hope now carry the weight of danger, and the simple act of worshiping your God could cost you your life. This is not just a story about the past. It's a reflection of struggles humanity has faced throughout history and in many ways still faces today. From ancient times to modern societies, there have always been moments when faith, freedom, and culture come under fire, when powers greater than individuals try to silence voices that refuse to bow. To understand the courage of those who stood against such oppression, we must travel back to a time when Israel was caught in the iron grip of the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids, heirs to the fractured empire of Alexander the Great, were not content with military power alone. They sought to reshape the hearts and minds of those they ruled, erasing the distinct faith of Israel and replacing it with Greek customs, gods, and philosophies. In this struggle, an ordinary people were forced into extraordinary choices. Do they abandon their covenant with God to survive? Or do they risk everything to hold on to the truth of their identity? The streets of Jerusalem in those days were tense with fear. Greek soldiers marched openly, their presence a daily reminder that the land of David and Solomon was no longer free. Sacred practices, circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary laws were banned under threat of death. Scrolls of the law were confiscated and burned, holy altars were defiled, and the temple itself, the very dwelling place of God, was transformed into a shrine to Zeus. What had been the pride of a people became a symbol of humiliation. Imagine being told that the faith passed down from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was now worthless, that the covenant between God and his people was to be broken at sword point. This was more than political oppression. It was an assault on the soul of a nation. Yet history has shown us something remarkable. When faith is outlawed, when truth is buried, it has a way of rising again, carried by those unwilling to surrender. Out of the shadows of fear emerged a group of ordinary men and women whose defiance turned them into legends. They were not kings or prophets at the start, but farmers, priests, sons and daughters, people who chose to resist when surrender seemed easier. In their struggle, we see the timeless story of how the smallest spark of faith can ignite a flame powerful enough to outlast empires. This story, known to history as the Maccabean Revolt, is not simply about war or rebellion. It is about identity, courage, and the refusal to let faith be extinguished. It is about a people who understood that freedom without faith is no freedom at all, and that true victory is not measured by armies, but by the endurance of the spirit. And though their enemies sought to erase them, the story of their defiance has been preserved for generations as a reminder that even in the darkest times, ordinary rebels can become extraordinary heroes. But this is not just their story, it is also our story. Every generation faces its own kind of oppression, sometimes obvious, sometimes subtle. There are moments when culture, politics, or ideology seeks to pressure individuals to conform, to silence conviction, to trade truth for comfort. Think of how often people today feel the weight of hiding who they truly are, whether it's their faith, their culture, or their heritage, just to fit into a world that demands uniformity. The ancient struggle of Israel under the Seleucids echoes into our present moment, reminding us that the cost of freedom has always been high, but so has the reward for those who stand firm. Imagine sitting with one of those rebels in the hills outside Jerusalem, a young man who only months before had been tilling his father's fields. He grips a worn blade, not forged in a king's armory, but sharpened in secret under the cover of night. His eyes burn with determination, not because he loves war, but because he cannot bear to see his people's covenant destroyed. He tells you, "I fight not because I want to, but because my God and my people leave me no choice." You can feel his heartbeat in those words, a heartbeat that belongs not only to him, but to all who refuse to bow to tyranny. The theme we will explore in this journey is simple yet powerful: how ordinary rebels became legendary. Their resistance began in whispers and ended in shouts, and along the way, their courage left an imprint that outlasted their enemies. They remind us that greatness does not begin in palaces, but in the willingness of the common man and woman to say no when the world demands yes. And as we step deeper into their story, we will see how the God of Israel used the humble to confound the mighty, the faithful few to shake the powers of the earth. So as you listen, don't just hear this as history, hear it as a challenge. What are the sacred things in your own life worth defending? What truths are you willing to risk for, even when the world says it's safer to remain silent? The rebels of old are not just distant figures. They are mirrors, reflecting the choices we all must face in our own way. And if this story moves you, if it stirs something inside you, then join us on this journey. Subscribe to the Bible Says channel and help us reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers, so more people can hear these forgotten stories of faith and freedom. Share this with those who need a reminder that courage still matters. If you'd like to support this work further, you can send a super thanks and help us continue bringing you hidden truths from the pages of history. And we'd love to hear from you. Comment your name, your city, and the time you're watching. Finally, check the description below for links to the complete Bible with 88 books and the full Book of Enoch in English, so you can explore these powerful texts for yourself. Because when faith is outlawed, when truth is suppressed, the story of the faithful rebels becomes more important than ever, and it begins here. Prior to the uprising, Israel was a deeply conflicted world, both internally and externally. A new cultural order emerged following Alexander the Great's swift conquests that swept across the known world. In addition to banners and weapons, his armies carried Greek traditions, art, and ideals. This Hellenistic influence started to change people's very manner of speaking, dressing, and even thinking. After Alexander's death, his enormous empire fell apart, and Judea was ruled by the Seleucid kings. They were committed to using Greek language, Greek gods, and Greek lifestyles to unite their subjects. They believed that changing the mindset of people they subjugated was more important than simply using force to rule. This was no typical cultural influence for the Jewish people, who had always considered themselves chosen to uphold the law and live under the covenant with their father's God. It was an attack on who they were. Idols were erected in towns where previously only the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was revered, and Greek festivals clashed with Hebrew customs. Greek gymnasiums and marketplaces brimmed with offerings to the pagan gods, and young men were urged to break with their forefathers. Every household was burdened with the demands to stop observing the Sabbath, dietary regulations, and circumcision. Families were split up. Some parents encouraged their children to adopt Greek customs, speak the language fluently, wear Greek, short tunics, and go to gymnasiums where the young people exercised in ways that were embarrassing to Jewish modesty out of fear of punishment or a desire for social advancement. Others fought tenaciously, claiming that adherence to the covenant was more valuable than life itself, more valuable than wealth, and more valuable than safety. Conversations became heated at family tables, with mothers torn between their devotion to God's commandments and their love for their children, and sons challenging fathers. The rulers of Seleucia were not tolerant. In the center of Jerusalem, they became more and more ruthless, requiring sacrifices to Zeus and other Greek deities. This was unimaginable to the faithful, a desecration of all that was sacred. The images of alien gods had corrupted the temple, which had once been the site of worship and the meeting point of heaven and earth. Priests who ought to have guided the populace in holiness were under pressure to make concessions, and some of them did so after being seduced by influence and bribes. For many pious Jews, every season seemed to bring their country closer to oblivion. Just as debilitating as the religious pressures were the social ones. While young men who adhered to the law were ridiculed, shunned, and viewed as backward, those who embraced Greek culture were praised and frequently granted privileges. Rich families occasionally opted for assimilation because they discovered that assuming Greek names and traditions allowed them to gain influence. However, the impoverished, who were already having difficulty surviving due to taxes and unstable political conditions, had little to gain from a compromise. They whispered the Psalms and told the tales of their ancestors who had survived Egypt, Babylon, and Persia, carrying their devotion in their hearts, frequently in secret. The question now was whether they would withstand or eventually shatter under the Seleucids. With each decree and every effort to take away their identity, the tension increased. The internal betrayal was what made it worse. In their own communities, Jews who worked with the Seleucids came to uphold Greek law. Those who circumcised their sons, those who gathered to study the Torah in secret, and those who refused to eat pork would all be reported. Neighbors' trust was damaged. Even a relative might betray for survival or favor, so who could one trust? It was a spiritual war, not just a conflict between tradition and innovation. The covenant was more than just tradition. It was the lifeblood of the populace and the connection that bound God to his people. Abandoning it meant letting go of their destiny and the promises that had gotten them through exile and back. Every act of defiance turned into an act of faith, a statement that they would sooner die than break the law. There were tales of old men refusing to taste forbidden foods even when threatened with torture, and of mothers who chose to let their Sons, be martyred rather than submit to pagan customs. In addition to being tragedies, these tales served as reminders that faith could triumph over fear and as a source of hope. The extent of this devotion was underestimated by the Seleucid kings. They thought they could eradicate centuries of faith and tradition by imposing Greek language, Greek gods, and Greek customs. In reality, however, they fanned the resistance fire. Every slight against the law strengthened the faithful's resolve. The will to resist was strengthened by every effort to place Zeus above Yahweh. Quiet conversations started in the countryside and villages. Craftspeople, farmers, and priests all spoke of rebellion and using weapons to preserve their identity rather than to conquer. Previously teaching their sons how to plow fields, fathers now started talking about courage, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. Once occasions for prayer and singing, the Sabbath gatherings evolved into spaces where defiance and faith coexisted. The seeds of an open revolt had been sown, but it was not yet complete. That seed was being nourished and growing in the hearts of the people with each slight against the covenant. Their sacred temple was desecrated, their holy city was crowded with idols, and they could see their children straying toward Greek ways. The weight of silence was too much to bear. To do nothing was to lose everything. Contradictions characterized the world prior to the uprising. At first glance, Hellenistic culture appeared to have won out. Greek theaters, gyms, and marketplaces were bustling with activity, while those who opposed lived in terror. However, something more powerful was establishing itself beneath that exterior. Despite being under constant pressure, the Jewish people retained a history of survival against powerful empires and a memory of deliverance. Egypt was no longer there. Babylon had collapsed. Persia had collapsed. Could Greece succumb to the resolve of a people who are devoted to their God as well? Their hearts ached from the weight of history and the covenant's promise. The Seleucids attempted to maintain a tenuous peace, and each act of oppression was another blow. When resistance would arise was now the question, not if it would. Families who fought between faith and survival would soon have to make decisions that would change not just their own future, but also the course of their country. The uprising was emerging from this furnace of pain and devotion in whispers, in silence, and in private prayers that God would one day send deliverers to restore his people and his law. Under the weight of foreign domination, the town of Modian sat silently, its residents treading carefully between devotion and survival. Rumors of rebellion had been rife in the Judean hills for years, but they were swiftly put down by the threat of Greek swords